So last week, I saw the movie Queer, and this was a very powerful film. Yet also, I wouldn't at all be surprised if it perplexed you because it very much perplexed me. There's actually a lot of background in this film that explains the countless symbols and symbolic scenes, and I feel like with my research and my personal reflection, at this point I think I can confidently explain to you every symbol in this movie, and what this movie is trying to say as a whole. Like the dream sequences, the centipede, the baby on the steps, the trippy ayahuasca dance sequence, the snake eating itself, the floating woman with the needle in her arm, the entire ending, and everything else. So let's get into this deep dive analysis. The film Queer is based on a book of the same title written by William S. Burroughs. Burroughs' book, a novella called Queer, is about a homosexual man named Lee who is driven to pursue a younger man, Allerton, just like the film. The character of Lee is based off of the book's author, Burroughs himself, and the story of Queer is inspired by Burroughs' own personal experience. Burroughs was a homosexual man leaving America in the 1950s to live in Mexico, eventually developing a relationship with a younger man. And more specifically, the character of Lee was written with the intention to reveal the side of Burroughs that he didn't want people to see. Lee is an unapologetically honest representation of Burroughs' greatest weaknesses, flaws, and insecurities, indulging in his greatest vices of sex, drugs, and alcohol, with a few much deeper underlying issues, which we'll certainly discuss very shortly. And at the time, with such a painful piece of work to write, his relationship coming to an end, and many other traumatic moments that we'll talk about soon, Burroughs abandoned the novella in the 1950s and it was left unfinished. It wasn't until the 1980s that the book was padded out for an official release with a new, longer intro and some other unreleased material attached. So ultimately this film is both an adaptation and homage that kind of fills in the blanks where the original piece of work wasn't complete, and dives very deeply into the emotions of both William Lee and his partner Eugene Allerton. In the intro to the film, this homage is established when we see script pages scattered over the bed in one of Lee and Allerton's rooms in South America, where we see the first pages of the manuscript for the book written by Burroughs, with some of the pages shaped into houses, establishing that the film we are about to watch will build a physical world and sense of location out of the unfinished pages of William S. Burroughs. And of course, right after the title card, we meet Lee, who, as mentioned before, is indulging into his vices and addictions like sex, drinking, and drugs. But it's crucial to understand that there is very much a reason for Lee's poor behavior. Lee's self-destructive lifestyle stems from a deep-rooted feeling of shame and self-hatred. As you can imagine, homosexuality in 1950s America was one of the most unacceptable and frowned-upon things in society. So what actually happened historically is many queer American white men would actually move south to Mexico, where their status as white American men amongst non-white Mexican men would actually have some sort of counterbalance in the way that they were perceived and respected still as gay men. Overall, life was just a little easier, especially considering that these gay communities would develop in certain areas, like in this setting in the film in Mexico City, for example. So it's Lee's lifelong experience of being shamed for his sexuality that has shaped him into this character that he's become. And I say character because one thing you might notice about him is how shameless and confident he seems. He's very outward about his sexuality, he's very outspoken, he tells you what he's thinking about you in the moment, he knows what he wants and who he wants, and he doesn't wait to shoot a shot, he goes for it. But if you pay a little closer attention, you'll notice that his attitude and his character is much more of a momentary coping mechanism than a long-term solution to the shame. It's all a band-aid rather than an antidote for the insecurity. He can be quite overbearing with his partners, giving them less of a chance to speak than himself, talking over them, and sometimes forcing them to stick around when they need to leave. You can even tell by the way he laughs and the way he speaks, it's all a little artificial, covering up something beneath that's so much harder for him to face. And that's exactly why this book was so hard for William Burroughs to write. He's exploring that very reality that he's always wanted to hide. Deep down, Lee is lonely, depressed, and exhausted, and this persona and this lifestyle is just this continuous, never-ending strategy to distract himself from those true feelings. A symbol of this early on in the film is when we see Lee's body become translucent, with the audio becoming muffled, all representing this desire to exist outside of himself, detached from the intensity of public perception and shame. It's the same reason for the constant drinking, sex, and drug use. It's it's this everlasting numbness that he desperately chases and needs in order to get through life. Eugene Allerton, on the other hand, although from a younger generation, is suffering from the exact same feeling of shame and self-hatred. However, Allerton copes with the shame and self-hatred in the opposite way. Instead of pushing himself upon others like Lee, Allerton pulls himself away. He hides his deepest feelings with this quiet, stoic, ice-cold exterior, where it was even hard for Lee to tell if Allerton was at all interested in him, when in retrospect, he most certainly was. And because both parties in this romantic relationship have deeply scarring experiences of self-loathing and disapproval from their public, and they deal with this same issue in opposite ways, their relationship and their love is continuously out of sync. It's this constant push and pull, Lee pushing too hard when Allerton needs the space, and Allerton pulling too far away when Lee needs the attention. And it's at these very odd moments in the film that are actually way too few and far between that they actually do connect perfectly. When Lee is being more natural in his affection and Allerton is in a state of feeling more open to affection. And this makes a lot of sense out of director Luca Guadagnino's quote about the relationship between Allerton and Lee. We knew this was a love story about two people who were not in sync more than they were in sync. It wasn't a story about unrequited love. It wasn't a story about someone trying to convince somebody else to love him back. It was about the possibility within the impossibility. So ultimately, Luca is saying that this film is about two people being torn apart by the same fear and shame, when at the same time, they are so deeply in love with each other. There are even scenes where we see Lee's truest feelings of affection towards Allerton that are symbolically independent of what he's actually doing. This translucent version of himself transcending the physical and giving Allerton the softest, warmest gesture of love and affection. And of course, as this film continues, when Allerton is pulling himself further away, Lee falls further into his vices to the point where he has this nightmarish dream after passing out drunk. And if you haven't read the novella or aren't really familiar with William Burroughs' life, this dream sequence will very likely not make very much sense to you, so I can explain. So in this dream sequence to start, Lee sees a bunch of people in his life dressed as prisoners. This moment reflects a traumatic period in Burroughs' life where he was convicted for accidentally killing his wife, and we'll discuss how she died a little later in this video. We also see a baby lying on the steps crying as if it was abandoned. And this likely ties in with Burroughs' relationship with his son, where because of his addictions and trouble with the law, he couldn't be there to raise his son who was raised by his grandparents, and eventually suffered a similar fate to his father, falling into addiction and crime, including manslaughter. And next, we see this torso of a woman floating above this table, and Lee starts touching her body. And she says something along the lines of, "Lee, I thought you never liked women. I thought you were queer." And to me, this all reflects Burroughs' history with his wife, who he clearly wasn't truly in love with. Her upper legs and everything above are the only things that are visible. I assume because that is the only aspect of a woman that really intensely triggers straight men sexually, and that is what William Burroughs is battling against in his marriage. And the needle in her arm more obviously represents the severe addiction that she and her husband, William Burroughs, struggled through all throughout their marriage. And at the end of the sequence, Lee says, "I'm not queer, I'm just disembodied," which ties in with Lee's continuous desire to escape his physical body, indicated by his indulgent habits and addictions, and symbolized by the image of his translucent self escaping his physical self. Also, it's important to note that the word queer in the 1950s didn't at all have the positive connotation that it can have now. And when your sexuality is only acknowledged and defined as a negative thing in your society, even somewhat by your own community, it's inevitable that you'll feel disembodied. You'll feel that you belong nowhere by what you've been conditioned to believe your entire life. And when Lee feels most connected with Allerton, he feels like they aren't speaking verbally through their own physical mouths. It feels so much more like a spiritual communication to him than a verbal one. Therefore, Lee seeks out the Yahweh plan, which he has heard allows people to speak without words. So he believes if he and Allerton can have this plan, maybe they can fully tap into that deeply spiritual connection and it can strengthen their relationship. And a very interesting note about this is Lee never truly admits his real intentions for seeking out the Yahe plant. Whenever he speaks about it out loud, he always dances around his true intention of seeking out the plant for himself and Allerton and their relationship. There's this element of shame and insecurity in admitting why he truly wants it, and it all ties in with this internal fear of who he truly is and what he truly wants. And eventually, when Allerton agrees to go with Lee to South America, when Lee agrees to give him the appropriate space and distance, they both find the Yahe plant together with the help of Dr. Carter, who knows how to brew the real ayahuasca beverage, which in real life is known to open people's minds to new spiritual connections with other people and even those beyond this dimension. So when the two of them drink the ayahuasca, they do actually tap into that spiritual connection that Lee has always been seeking out and hoping for. The trip sequence starts with the two of them vomiting these inflating bubbles that pop their hearts onto the ground. This, of course, symbolizes them entering this state where their truest feelings of love are now inevitably exposed, and they are both inevitably open to connect completely. And in the following sequence, exactly that happens. Allerton says to Lee, "I'm not queer, I'm just disembodied." Admitting to that same fear that Lee has, explaining all of his distance and reluctance with Lee all in one line. And then they begin this spiritual dance where they are lifting each other, holding each other, caressing each other, falling into each other's arms, even at times blending bodies and moving in and out of one another. All movements symbolizing the state of true codependence, connectedness, and of course, love. And I think it's best for me to include Luca's description of this sequence. It is, of course, the idea of fusing yourself with someone. It's scary to people because you feel this idea of self-annihilation in one another. But in this case, it was a portal open for the two of them to finally accept their mutual love. But then they can't continue because they are too scared. And that is exactly what happens next. In the next shot, when the ayahuasca is worn off and they are back in the sober state of their physical bodies, we see Lee show affection and Allerton pull away. They are back out of sync. But this is what neither of them truly want, because in the next shot, we see Lee's eyes welling up and a tear fall down Allerton's face while he's just holding together the most stoic expression. When Dr. Carter asks them to take the ayahuasca again, Allerton refuses. There's too much fear for who he truly is still. And although Lee seems more willing, he still holds that exact same form of fear as well. In the next scene, we cut forward 2 years, and Lee hasn't seen Allerton since. We see Lee look into a model of a building, with him in it, of course representing a moment of introspection. We see Lee enter a room with Allerton laying on the bed. He's wearing a centipede symbol that we first saw worn by a man who had a one-night stand with Lee. This visual captures the devastating reality lingering in Lee's mind of Allerton being a romantic partner to never be seen again, just like one of his many forgotten one-night sexual partners. Also, Allerton puts a shot glass on his head and Lee shoots him in the head as if he was supposed to shoot the shot glass off of his head. And this moment is very introspective, not only for Lee, but William Burroughs, as that is the exact way Burroughs allegedly killed his wife. Put very simply, they were both intoxicated playing this game with a real gun, and Burroughs shot his wife in the head. So, of course, this is a loaded symbol of a scene capturing the mountains of tragedy, trauma, and shame that Lee and the real William Burroughs live with devastating endings to relationships that have only led to a darker path down this road of regret and loneliness. And what also ties in with this is the image of the snake eating its own tail in the shape of an infinity symbol. A snake eating its own tail is historically known as something called Ouroboros, a symbol for everlasting destruction and rebirth. Although Lee's romance has come to an end and his life is coming to an end, there is a new beginning on the horizon. In the very final scene, we see old man Lee laying in bed with young Allerton laying his leg over Lee's leg, the same way he showed support and affection during Lee's moments of withdrawal in South America. And in that same initial scene, we saw how that little moment of physical communication felt telepathic between the two of them, by us next seeing a shot of them telepathically pushing the words of a manuscript back and forth between one another. To me, this scene perfectly ties together the idea that Lee and Allerton's love in its truest form is transcendent of reality and the physical world. Lee and his love Allerton will both one day pass away, now truly disembodied, entering a phase of the spiritual self in its purest form, once again completely and forever open to one another. All right, that's my analysis. I hope you enjoyed, and happy holidays. And if there are any questions that you have, or you have any thoughts that you want to discuss, I'd be happy to discuss them and answer those questions in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching, and see you later.